Hello everybody, welcome to Drydock episode 40, and as always we start with some channel admin. First off, I do apologise for episode 39's sources pictures not showing up. I have no idea quite why that is. I think there's some kind of conflict between certain image file extensions on my video editing software and the files themselves. It's fine with JPEGs and PNGs and stuff, but the particular file types for these photos and just didn't seem to agree with it. Anyway, that said, the other bit of channel admin to announce is that there will be a competition that's being launched with this Drydock, and prizes will be given out. Prizes and type of competition to be announced at the end of this video. So on with questions. So the videos for this week are the video on HMS Indefatigable and the video on Destroyers Concept and Development 1860 to 1914. The sources for the HMS Indefatigable video are To Rule the Waves by Arthur Herman, followed by a whole panoply of books including Frigates of the Napoleonic Wars, The Ship of the Line, Warships of the Napoleonic Era, and Naval Warfare in the Age of Sail. So hopefully this time pictures of all of those should be appearing on your screens now. So let's get on with the questions from that video, or at least some of them. Warren Lemke asks, if the US went to war with Napoleon and sent the Navy to help the British, how would they have performed in an alternate Battle of Trafalgar? As far as an alternate Battle of Trafalgar goes, they probably wouldn't have taken much part because the US Navy circa 1805 had a rather noticeable lack of ships of the line. The heaviest ships they had were the 6 frigates, and whilst they were very good frigates, they would not be capable of standing up to a ship of the line, and they certainly wouldn't have been rated as such. I mean, fair enough, given the performance of some of the French and Spanish ships of the line, you might think that something like the Constitution might stand a chance, and, well, you might be right, but I don't think anyone in either the American or British fleets would have wanted to risk sending what was effectively a heavy frigate up against a 74-gun minimum ship of the line, and obviously there were quite a number of 80, 90 and 100-plus gun ships. So, yeah, when you talk about a battle where 74-gun third rates were coming out very badly battered, sending in what's effectively a light to medium fourth rate is not going to be a good outcome. That said, in broader and more general terms, aside from the issue that obviously declaring war with Napoleon would have meant America's no longer trading with Napoleon, which would have hindered the French war effort quite significantly, but in terms of pure ship-to-ship combat, the 6 frigates, if they'd been sent out on commerce raiding and prize-taking missions, probably would have proven very effective. They were pretty swift, even for frigates. They were very well armed, and they had a fairly large crew, which would have suited them very well to prize-taking. And of course, with the French on the back foot and the British Navy on their side, they wouldn't have had to worry so much about being blockaded in port and such like as happened historically. So, yeah, they probably would have been highly effective commerce raiders, and probably would have brought in quite the number of French ships as well as prizes to enlarge the US Navy. Franzel 41 asks, would targeting the superstructure of a ship be an effective way to render it combat ineffective? The ship wouldn't sink but couldn't do much of anything if everything not protected by armour was wrecked. So in finest tradition, the answer is, well, yes, but actually no. Anyway, no, targeting the superstructure, yes, it would be a fairly effective way to render a ship combat ineffective, and we do see evidence of this in a number of battles, because basically this is where your command and control center is, and this is also where your main fire control systems and rangefinders generally tend to be as well, if you're not using the turret rangefinders. So, we see, like, for example, when Prince of Wales at the Battle of Denmark Strait takes a shell to the bridge, that renders the ship combat ineffective for a few minutes till people pick themselves up and keep going. Bismarck is rendered combat ineffective by a couple of hits that wipe out its fire control system and pretty much everybody on the bridge, which, again, superstructure hits. It is a little bit of a delicate point. So yes, in theory, if you could target the superstructure, you could render a ship combat ineffective. The two problems with that is one, the superstructure is a much smaller target than the structure of the ship generally, with an ancillary of being smaller and more lightly built. Armor-piercing shells are more likely to just pass straight through it, so you'd have to possibly, for better results, resort to high explosive, which would then mean you'd be very unlikely to be able to engage the rest of the structure of the ship effectively. But the secondary main problem, apart from the issues with targeting, is that the gun turrets themselves also have their own rangefinders and a degree of backup fire control. So yes, you can target and knock out the superstructure, and it would dramatically decrease the combat effectiveness of a ship, but there's a relatively good chance that its turrets will still continue to operate under local control. So you are going to have to switch to AP, and obviously, in the amount of time it's taking you to score accurate hits on the small target of the superstructure, before you knock out the fire control systems, it's entirely possible that the ship might have counter-batteried you and hit you with AP in more sensitive locations. But that said, for something like a destroyer or a cruiser that ends up in a close range fight with a capital ship, as did happen somewhat often in World War II, it's definitely an option, because at that point your AP isn't going to be doing anything to the turrets or the main belt, so that's your next best, most effective way of taking out an enemy capital ship, or at least inconveniencing it enough that it doesn't blow you out of the water. Bredley asks, Australia versus Canada, 1939 and 1945, whose navy would win in a brawl? It's actually fairly clear-cut either way. In 1939, the Royal Australian Navy is going to take that fight hands down on account of being a far more capable fighting force, as well as actually having, well, for the definition of the term, capital ships. They've got heavy cruisers and light cruisers, so as well as destroyers, and yeah, as a result, with the cruisers on hand, as well as destroyers and such, then the Royal Canadian Navy is outnumbered and outgunned, so that's going to go the Australians' way quite easily. Conversely, if you're talking about a brawl where both sides are set at near point blank range and just have to start hammering away at each other, by 1945 the Royal Canadian Navy is absolutely massive, and although it's mostly small ships, but in a brawl, small ships with torpedoes and small guns, etc., can be pretty lethal. Just ask the Japanese. And so, yeah, in 1945, the Canadians are going to take it by sheer weight of numbers, apart from anything else. Alex Lamb asks, how would a Constitution Class Frigate stand up to an Indefatigable Class Razee? So this is a very interesting one. In the video covering USS Constitution, we looked at Constitution versus HMS Majestic and concluded Majestic had a significant advantage. However, although a Razee frigate, Majestic was cut down from a 74 gun, whilst Indefatigable was cut down from a 64 gun ship of the line. So Indefatigable's starting position was weaker compared to Majestic's. So if we look at the comparison of the two, Constitution and Indefatigable, let's take a quick look. Now, in this circumstance, Indefatigable is actually an armament disadvantage in a close-range firefight. They both carry main gun decks of 24-pounder guns. However, Indefatigable carries 26 of them, whereas Constitution carries 30. So that's a 4-gun difference, 2 extra guns per broadside for the Constitution. That's not a dramatic difference, but and obviously both ships are built to the sort of standards of a ship of the line hull-wise, so the durability advantage that Constitution held over many of its opponents doesn't apply so much here. But when you look at the quarterdeck and forecastle armaments, Constitution has a couple of 24-pounder bow chasers, whereas the Indefatigable has 4 12-pounders and a couple of 42-pounder carronades. So if one is running from the other, Indefatigable is likely to do more damage once it gets closer in. However, the quarterdeck armament, which is obviously relevant more for the broadside, Indefatigable's carrying a bunch of 12-pounders and 4 42-pounder carronades, whereas Constitution is carrying 20 32-pounder carronades. So the carronades themselves are slightly smaller than on Indefatigable, but there's an awful lot more of them. There's 10 of them per broadside as opposed to 4 12-pounders and 2 42s for Indefatigable. So in terms of absolute broadside weight, Indefatigable has a disadvantage compared to Constitution. So the battle looks like it's probably more going to go Constitution's way. The flip side to that is, however, that the Indefatigable has slightly less draft and has a slightly fatter length to beam ratio, which means it's going to be more agile than Constitution. So in a straight up gunfight, if you plonk them next to each other and have them blaze away at each other, Constitution has a definite firepower advantage, especially at close range. Indefatigable has a very, very slight edge in longer range cannonades, but that rarely decides anything unless one side or the other gets lucky and takes out masts and spars. So yeah, it's basically Indefatigable is going to be the underdog, but it has a chance, partly based on the fact that the big gun armament is relatively similar, but more to do with the fact that it's possible the Indefatigable might be able to outmaneuver the Constitution and get a couple of raking broadsides in. And if it manages to do that, then obviously that changes the balance massively. But, as I say, Constitution advantage there. And lastly for this video, Lexington476 asks, which ship was the first Razee and who came up with the Razee idea? In terms of a formal arrangement, probably HMS Anson, 1794. That was along with Magnanime and Indefatigable a few months later. But the idea of Razeeing a ship, it kind of grew out of the Tudor period of cutting down, well, initially building what so-called race-built galleons by, as the term at the time was called, racing, which obviously raised or eventually turned into Razee the fore and after castles. But those ships were built purpose-built for in that nature. But in the 17th century, as various navies realised the value of this, they started cutting down the upper works of pre-existing ships as well. So one of the earliest stated examples of this happening to a warship is actually Sovereign of the Seas, which was initially built with huge fore and after castles and then cut down. So technically Sovereign of the Seas is technically a Razee capital ship for most of its career. So it'd be very difficult to pinpoint exactly when the first ship had fore and after castles knocked down in order to, or decks reduced in order to make it more maneuverable. Because I say this thing happened was happening all the time in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, including in the hands of pirates when they got their hands on ships and wanted to make them faster. But in terms of formal program, yeah, probably HMS Anson at the end of the 1700s. And now we come on to the destroyer's basically pre-World War I development video. So the sources for this were primarily Warrior to Dreadnought by D.K. Brown, along with a number of smaller supplementary articles, along with Conway's All the World's Fighting Ships 1860 to 1905, a very handy bit of reference material that is. And so on to questions. Wolfson28 asks, if the Japanese had continued to observe the Washington and London naval treaties, what would an early to mid-30s replacement for the Kongo class or Fuso class have looked like? There's actually quite a body of surviving designs in this regard that the Japanese prepared by their two leading designers, Hiraga and Fujimoto. Comments in the description about how I horribly mangled those names if you want. But anyway, there's some artist impressions appearing of some of their designs above now, but in terms of designs they actually wanted to go for that stuck within the treaty limits, some of the ones that are, well, slightly more commonly known is Hiraga proposed a 35,000-ton battle cruiser, which had three variants, two of which were 26-knot variants, and one was a 23-knot variant. So this was, although they were Kongo replacements, they were more on the lines of battleships rather than battle cruisers. All of these replacements were armed with 16.1-inch guns similar to Nagato. However, Design A was looking at 3 triple turrets for 9 guns. Design B was looking at 2 quads and a twin for 10 guns, and both these were 26-knot ships. And then the final version was almost like King George V or North Carolina early designs with 3 quad 16-inch guns for 23 knots. Obviously, as you might expect, armour was not particularly a high priority compared to some of the other treaty-era battleship designs by other nations. There were also some smaller variants, 30, 25 and 20k ton versions, but no, they weren't obviously so much direct replacements. Fujimoto's ideas, as opposed to Hiraga's, looked at, again, something of a mixed bag, but one of his variants looked at 2 triples and 2 twins with 16.1-inch guns, again for a total of 10 guns. So, and yeah, those are the designs, and I hope you find those a little bit interesting. I say that they're relatively well known amongst people who are seriously into this kind of stuff, but they sit just below the level of awareness of sort of most levels of interest. So yeah, if you want me to go into more detail on those particular designs, I can add them to the list of never built ships to be reviewed. A chap who wants to call himself James asks, why did the Germans use turtleback armour in their battleships, and what were the negative effects of this armour layout? So this will be covered in a lot more detail in about a month or so, and I have covered it in a little bit before, but very quickly. Basically, why the Germans used turtleback armour in their battleships, because they had basically no experience building battleships continuously or redesigning them, etc. in the interwar period, thanks to the Treaty of Versailles, so they were a little bit behind the times on armour layout. And also the turtleback scheme was seen as slightly better for close-range slugging matches, which is what they thought their ships would be involved in. What were the negative effects? The main negative effect, as you can see from the picture here, it was that the amount of space that was available underneath the armour was significantly reduced compared to the more modern schemes used by, well, you can see in this case King George V, but also in obviously American battleships, Italian battleships, etc. So that meant that you had to have all your vital stuff crammed much closer together, which made it more vulnerable if the armour was breached, and in certain circumstances could also mean that you might not have everything that was important to the ongoing survivability of the ship under the armour, which could then obviously be breached or destroyed by ships that were, by shells, sorry, that hit and didn't penetrate the armour, just burst above the armour, but might still kill something fairly vital. The Cat with a Top Hat asks, here's a real quick one. At 18 minutes 15 seconds in the video, you showed a ship, and I was wondering what ship that was. This ship is HMS Spider. Arachnophobes look away now. A Spider was a Grasshopper class torpedo boat, one of the ones that we were discussing in that particular video. And as you can see, it has a little cute stubby gun on the front. That's a single 4-inch gun, along with a couple of torpedo tubes and a scattering of 3-pounder guns. So yeah, it's obviously, as you can see from all the flags on it at the minute in this photo, it's on review in probably one of the Spithead naval reviews at the time. Makise Kuristina, I think, says, how and why did destroyers supersede cruisers in the modern day to be jack-of-all-trades ships? Short answer is size creep. It's something that's affected warships ever since warships were developed, and in this particular iteration, you can trace that all the way back to the end of the 19th century. So the initial torpedo boats, torpedo boat destroyers, destroyers, you're talking about ships of a few hundred tons. Small cruisers were ships of maybe 2,000 to 3,000 tons. And then bigger cruisers and battleships got up to 8, 9, up to 12, 14,000 tons in that kind of size range. Battleships started to increase in size, cruisers started to increase in size, destroyers started to increase in size. So by the time you get to the end of World War II, you're looking at destroyers of 2 to 3,000 tons or more. So talk about destroyers with a kind of displacement that a small cruiser 30, 40 years ago would have had. Cruisers, by the end of the war, the sort of things like the Baltimore and the Worcester and Des Moines and all the other designs that people come up with immediately after are in the mid-teens, sort of 15,000 tons up to 20,000 tons, and give or take a bit. And battleships obviously have gone through the roof to Iowa and Yamato scale vessels. Post-war, this trend continues, and then you start to see frigates coming in, because obviously frigates, with destroyers having moved out of the few hundred to low 1,000-ton range, you get frigates and corvettes inserting themselves into that particular bracket. And as size escalation increases throughout the latter part of the 20th century, effectively cruisers just become too expensive. Sort of iterating on the designs of something like a Des Moines, you end up looking at ships that are in the 25, 30,000 ton range. Obviously, you've got the Alaskas verging on the edge of being battle cruisers. But yeah, effectively, you're looking at to succeed, to make a better cruiser than the one that's gone before, you end up looking at having to make a ship that's got a displacement that wouldn't be particularly unfamiliar to a World War I era battleship, at which point it's far too expensive to do. So people then default down, what's the next level down? And at this point, destroyers have grown to between 5,000 and 8,000 tons, and suddenly they can do everything that a light cruiser used to be able to do. And a light cruiser was pretty much the jack of all trade ship for the majority of the immediate pre-war period and World War II period. So it kind of takes over the role because its size and displacement is about right. And obviously nowadays you're seeing destroyers that have broken the 10,000 ton limit by quite a bit. So ironically enough, we have ships that today we call destroyers that would actually be in violation of the Washington Naval Treaty restrictions on cruisers. So that's where it sits at the minute. In theory, you could, I mean, if you look at something like the Zumwalt class destroyers, etc., the lines between what is a destroyer and what is a cruiser are beginning to get a bit blurred. I mean, the Ticonderogas started off as a destroyer hull that they just slapped other stuff on and called a cruiser because cruiser gap. So I would guess when you look at things like, say, the US Navy's FFGX competition, where now they finally admitted that LCS isn't exactly what they wanted or needed, and like the high-end frigates that are being built, like the Type 26 in the UK, I rather suspect if we look 10, 15 years down the line, you might now then see frigates becoming the jack of all trades vessel, and the destroyers becoming the high-end capital ships, unless of course somebody decides to rename everything again. Nick Walsh asks, during the 1910s and 20s, the US came up with plans for war against the British. So did the Germans. War against the Americans, obviously. What would a naval engagement between those navies have looked like? It very much depends on what time period you're looking at, because the naval balance of power in the 1910s and the 1920s changes dramatically. But if we, let's look at the 1910s, because, let's briefly say, in the 1920s, a war between the German Navy and the American Navy is a one-sided curb stomp because the Germans don't have a navy, pretty much. But we'll come back to that a bit later. 1910s, so pre-World War I, basically. The Germans have a larger navy by a fairly significant margin, and the British have an absolutely massive margin of advantage if we're talking about 1912, 1913, 1914 period. This means that with the larger number of ships to hand, either the British or German fleets would look for a decisive engagement if they thought they could pull one off. However, their strategies were somewhat different. The Germans, in their plans for war with the US, and don't shoot the messenger, this is genuinely what the Kaiser wanted to do, was to load up a massive German field army in transport ships and passenger liners and escorted by the High Seas Fleet, who would have been very, very uncomfortable by the time they'd crossed the entire Atlantic in their ships that were not known for their crew comforts. They wanted to rock up off the coast of New York and force the Americans into a decisive fleet battle on the grounds that if the Americans declined a decisive fleet battle, they would then land loads of German troops in New York and take it over. Quite what they planned to do after this, I'm not entirely sure. I believe it was something along the lines of, well, and this might carry eerie similarities to some other wars America has fought with various countries in the beginning of the 20th century. The idea was show how much stronger you are and how much better you are, and then the Americans will cave in and seek peace terms. Well, that was their idea anyway. So that was the German idea. The British idea was actually a little bit more refined and consisted primarily of completely strangle America's trade and its economy by blockading it, cutting it off from world trade completely, cutting off obviously in the revenue streams it was making from imports and exports, and then look for American forces trying to break the blockade. If they try and break the blockade in small units, sort of squadrons of ships or individual ships, then sink them with the blockading forces. And if they start marshalling their fleet, obviously bring the British fleet to bear and face them in a grand battle, which knocks out the American fleet. So both British and German plans in the 1910s involved eventually some kind of grand naval battle in relatively short order, although the British took a slightly longer view of things. And that was to exploit the fact that at the time of declaring war, both of those navies would have significantly larger fleets, and obviously the Americans would also have the slight problem some of their ships would be stuck in the Pacific. Now, as to the American plans for that particular period, well, obviously the Americans aren't stupid. They're not going to go and gather up all half dozen of their dreadnought battleships and throw them pell-mell into a battle where they're outnumbered 3 or 4 to 1. So the American strategy at the time would have, in eerie rendition of the War of 1812, relied mostly on point raiding and trying to husband their strength until, unlike the War of 1812, their industry could catch up and build a fleet large enough to challenge. So they would have probably used mass-produced destroyers to annoy and harass their opponents whilst they tried to build up their fleet numbers. They would have been at a fairly significant disadvantage in that respect, in as far as they basically have no intermediate fleet elements, cruisers and the like, of any particular use. So they would have had to build up an entire fleet screen as well as an entire battle fleet, whilst their opponents are also reinforcing the ones that they've already got with new construction. But never underestimate the American ability to churn out massive numbers of destroyers. So that would have been 1910s, and with obviously the USN eventually trying to seek some kind of decisive fleet action once they thought they could get some kind of advantage. Again, eerie renditions of what the High Seas Fleet was trying to do to the British in World War One. In the 1920s, pretty much, well, obviously we said Germany versus Britain, Germany versus America is not going to happen, but America versus Britain. After the Washington Naval Treaty, the balance of power is a lot closer, albeit that in the early to mid 1920s, the British still have an advantage. So again, it would have been more along the lines of the American fleet trying to concentrate to form a battle force that could take out a substantial portion of the British fleet, while the British fleet again tries to sort of hold America down until it chokes with an economic blockade. That would have been a lot more of no plan survives first contact with the enemy, because the balance of forces is so close. Sort of cruiser warfare, lucky strikes, maybe an opportunistic shore bombardment or an opportunistic raid by a couple of squadrons of American battleships could change the war planning entirely, so who knows with that. And so with those out the way, it's time to do what we always do on the first dry dock of the month. It's Patreon question time. So Jack Andrew Hunter asks, with the Kriegsmarine focusing on surface commerce raiders early on in the war, then switching this focus to U-boats, what results could the Kriegsmarine have had if their focus had been on mines instead? Well, Focus on mines, you say?
Oh, hello, new friends.
Yes, well, I think the German mines would have been very enthusiastic about this. But in more serious response, if the Kriegsmarine had focused on mine laying, so mine laying ships, mine laying subs, etc., minesweeping technology had come on a fair bit, but at the same time, the Germans did have the magnetic mine, and it did take the British quite a while to figure that particular little doozy out. Um, so, in terms of overall effect, if they'd just gone out and suddenly dumped thousands upon thousands upon thousands of mines everywhere, um, that probably, to be honest, probably would have had more of effect than the German surface raiders. Partly due to just, well, sheer number of mines. They know where all the Royal Navy anchorages are. They've got a lot more preparation time because, well, they know they're probably heading to war anyway. Obviously, without commerce raiders and U-boats, the ability to sink convoys, ships at sea in convoys, is significantly reduced. But it could have some interesting implications for things like the Channel Dash, not the Channel Dash, but Channel Warfare. Sorry, there were a lot of Channel convoys that the Luftwaffe did their very best to attack. So if say they could coordinate and lay a new minefield overnight in the path of a convoy, then the Luftwaffe attacks during the day, and then obviously whilst the convoy is distracted by the air attacks, they might run into the minefield. The British were very good at clearing mines as well, but they still did lose quite a number of ships to mines. So I think overall, early war effectiveness probably would have been quite high. And even though numbers of ships lost may not have been quite as dramatic as you might otherwise expect, the effect on British commerce would have been very significant because if there's a U-boat around, especially in the early war, you can stick escorts and hammer the area with sonar and such like, so that it kind of is suppressed. Whereas if you try and sail a convoy into a port and half a dozen ships suddenly blow up from mine hits, you're going to shut that port down until you're sure that you've got a swept channel. And if you've got mine laying U-boats popping in and out every couple of days, reinforcing that mined channel, sort of remining the channel, then you are going to cripple all the ships. Even if you don't sink them, there's going to be a lot of ships sitting offshore not willing to risk it. So, but as minesweeping efforts increased and anti-submarine warfare, which obviously with things like sonar does lend itself to anti-mine warfare as well, and magnetic minesweeps and things like that, as technology increased during the war, it would have had a decreasing level of impact. Bill Brockman asks, can you discuss the development of anti-aircraft systems brought about by the Royal Navy's experiences in the Falklands War? Well, one of the primary things that was identified was you need better anti-aircraft systems. There's a saying that I've heard and probably applies to a lot of weapon systems, but particularly to anti-aircraft missiles, which is that if every surface-to-air missile worked exactly as the manufacturer said they would, every aircraft in the world would have been shot down twice over by now. Obviously, there are aircraft still flying, so yeah, you can work out how that quote is aimed. And this was pretty much shown in the Falklands War. On paper, the Royal Navy had some fairly capable surface-to-air missile systems, Sea Dart and Seawolf, for example. They were still wandering around with some rather obsolete systems, but that's another one of the lessons learned. However, as it turned out, if you rig a navy to fight an open water combat against primarily incoming large anti-shipping missiles and high-flying bombers, and then you end up fighting a coastal conflict where the enemies come screaming in at wave-top height, dropping conventional bombs and popping off the odd exocet, your missile systems suddenly perform much, much less well when it comes to operating in conditions that they weren't actually really designed for. One of the other lessons was, no, just because you have a surface-to-air missile system doesn't mean it's actually of any use. A few of the British ships in the Falklands had the old Sea Slug system floating around, and terrifying as that weapon is, with its four full first stage massive engines and a sound like a hell's mouth itself opening, it turned out that actually, yeah, you might have that missile system. It is of a zero practical use against a modern aircraft. It did have a very useful effect in terms of being a great morale breaker, because it turns out when you fire this massive four column of flame roaring, relatively slow, what looks like small ballistic missile across the heads of a bunch of terrified Argentinian conscripts, they tend to give up because they wonder what the hell else crazy thing you're going to do. But yeah, so lesson number one: get rid of your obsolete anti-aircraft systems. They are literally just weighing your ship down, and bringing more explosives in for all the use that that is. Lesson two: you need to have much broader spectrum surface-to-air missile systems, not things designed for one specific mission just because you think that's the most likely. Lesson three: point defense missiles are very, very useful. Previously, the things like the Seawolf system had been seen primarily as kind of, well, we'll just stick it on to small ships because we can't afford to put on proper surface-to-air armament, but it became very evident that this kind of short-range surface-to-air system was very much part of a ship's, any ship's good aircraft self-defense system. Then you also had the lessons about gunfire, because up until that point, kind of like with the Vietnam War and everyone going, oh yeah, fighter aircraft don't need cannon, a lot of naval thinking had gone along the lines of probably don't need anti-aircraft guns anymore. Missiles will do the job. And as a result, well, ships were lost as a result of it. The surprisingly high performance of a number of hand-operated, believe it or not, 40mm guns that weren't quite World War II vintage, but wouldn't have looked out of place in World War II, including things like the two wing 40mm mounts on Fearless and Intrepid, the landing ships. They actually sort of reinvigorated a drive towards gun-based point defense. So although the US obviously already had things like Phalanx, you had things like Phalanx and Goalkeeper becoming much more widespread across ships as a last-ditch defense system. So effectively, the Falklands War sort of bootstrapped people into going for a much more varied, multi-layered system of defense, where you've got long-range missiles, short-range missiles, and then backup anti-aircraft guns. Yeah, so, oh, and as well as that, radar. Yeah, having a radar that jams your satellite communication system, or alternatively, a radar that you cannot use when you are using your satellite communication system because it jams your own radar, turns out to not be such a good idea. So the spectrum of radar and the spectrum of communications was forced to diverge an awful lot more as well. And all of this, along with the general shortcomings, even when missiles were able to be launched within what were ostensibly their proper engagement envelopes, especially at lower altitudes, prompted much more work into missiles and radar systems being able to engage low-flying targets that might be otherwise hidden in either ground or sea clutter on the radar screens, as well as just improving seeker heads generally. And although they weren't put to the most sort of the worst tests in Gulf War One, the few times that various coalition warships did have to engage with surface-to-air batteries in the Gulf War did show significant performance improvements over the Falklands War era conflict. So yeah, it's the Falklands War was basically a case of finding a few things that actually worked as well or better than they expected, and an awful lot of things that performed significantly worse than expected. Luckily for everybody involved, it was discovered against an opponent where these failures meant you took a few more losses but could complete your mission, as opposed to, let's say, if a conventional war had broken out somehow between the USSR and the NATO allies in the early 80s. I rather suspect an awful lot of ships would have gone down far beyond what expectations would have been. And NATO realised that, which is why they changed everything in the next 10 years, and why these days the idea of so many ships nowadays being dedicated anti-aircraft warfare vessels with much more advanced systems, and that almost being the focus of most destroyer-sized ships has come about. Mason Asher Stewart asks, describe HMS Splendid. To which my answer would be, which HMS Splendid? There have been a few. I mean, not as many as there have been some other ships of the same name of similar names in the Royal Navy, but in more recent times, there's HMS Splendid the destroyer, HMS Splendid the conventional submarine, and HMS Splendid the nuclear-powered submarine. So yeah, let me know either by direct message on Patreon or whatever which HMS Splendid you are referring to, and I will make sure to include that as a supplementary question answered in next week's Drydock. Christopher Dent asks, how effective were float planes operated from capital ships? Are there any notable instances of them conferring a significant advantage during an engagement? So the float planes operated from capital ships, they did see a certain degree of use, especially in the early part of the Second World War, most notably for spotting for fire control during actual firefights, but also more generally for scouting and information. So on both sides actually of the hunt for the Graf Spey's Arado float plane and the various float planes equipped on the British ships both had significant roles to play during the hunt, with British ships using their float planes as scouts to try and find the German ship, and the German ship using its float planes to try and find merchant ships to target, and then also later on to look out for British ships that might be coming after it. In terms of engagements, at Mers El Kabir, there was a float plane wandering around, taking photos and radioing back full of shot during the British bombardment of the French fleet, which is where most of those overhead photos come from. What else was there? There were float planes airborne during the actual final engagement of the Graf Spee, trying to give some form of feedback. There were also one of the more famous ones, HMS Warspite's float plane during the Second Battle of Narvik, whichever Battle of Narvik it was when Warspite was there anyway. That went up the fjords ahead of Warspite and was then able to tell Warspite where the German destroyers were, even though you couldn't see them from the ship, which meant that rather than wandering around a corner and potentially getting torpedoed or shot up at close range, the Warspite was able to train its guns on the bit of headland, so as soon as the German destroyer came into sight, it was met with a 15-inch barrage of shells, which obviously was not very good for their health. So yeah, you had things like that, and both American and Japanese ship-based float planes had a number of roles in the early part of the Pacific War. But basically, what tended to happen was, well, one, in terms of fall-off shot spotting and things like that, obviously radar tended to replace aircraft in the latter part of the war, with a lot of ships losing their aircraft facilities and using the weight to install radar instead. And also, for the airships that retained those aircraft facilities, the float planes themselves became a lot more vulnerable as more and more powerful and more capable land-based aircraft, and obviously the proliferation of carriers and their fighters began to make float plane operations a lot more dangerous, and so the use of float planes for those two reasons tended to die out during the mid to late World War II period. And you'll notice that's why most of the examples I cited tended to happen in sort of 39 to 41. By the time the US Navy gets properly stuck into the Pacific War in 42, although float planes are still used, they are very much more of a second line type of use rather than the front line use they'd been designed for in the 1930s. Curtis Boyer asks, of the navies that had formally established Marines in the Age of Sail, were they issued with standard infantry equipment, or were there efforts made to equip them with things that were more conducive to the confines of a ship? For the most part, Marine Corps, US Marines, Royal Marines, Dutch Marines, etc., they were expected to fight on land in infantry engagements. See things like the War of 1812, Raid on the Medway, and various other engagements such as that. So they couldn't deviate too far from land-based infantry equipment because they could well expect to end up fighting land-based infantry. So they were issued with muskets and bayonets and such like. However, they did have to take into account the fact they were fighting at sea, and the other major part of their responsibility was to either board ships or defend their ship from being boarded. And so equipment did vary somewhat as a result of that. There was a lot more focus on close combat weaponry. So whereas in a line infantry regiment on land, the idea of close combat weaponry was fix your bayonet to your musket, and anything else that you might have beyond that would usually be personal equipment or something fairly small like a knife. With a lot of marine units, there some kind of sword would be issued quite often, and if it wasn't issued, they tended to pick them up very quickly. So naval cutlasses being a particularly widespread favourite in that respect, because boarding a ship, I mean, ships of the period are not particularly large, and to be honest, even ships these days, bigger though they are compared to a land-based war, it's still a much more enclosed, confined environment. So having a melee weapon to hand that was actually designed for the purpose was a very good thing. Other things that differed were the fact that, obviously, with the close quarters fighting nature of ship boarding actions, and the fact that, well, you're fighting at very short ranges, even if you're a sharpshooter. The sea service muskets tended to be shorter than their land-based equivalents. I mean, not that a musket is a particularly accurate long-range weapon anyway, but they were specifically shortened to ensure ease of use at sea, especially, again, as I say, in boarding actions. You also saw a number of other minor innovations, such as sort of spring locks for ramrods, because there's a much greater chance you'd be firing downwards at sea, especially if you're up in the mast. So you didn't want your ramrod to go sailing off into the distance as soon as you pointed it below 0 degrees elevation. A number of significantly shorter barreled weapons. I mean, what would loosely be classified as a blunderbuss, but also things called musketoons, both of which effectively sawn off muskets of in various ways, shape, or form. So those are around as well. We've already mentioned the melee weapons. Also, you would tend to see a lot of things like axes and large knives, because whilst a sword was relatively good for general melee combat, something like an axe was very good for cutting, rigging, ropes, lines, etc., as well, and burying it in your opponent. It's always a easy way of making sure someone doesn't get up again. So yeah, they were overall, they were still armed to be able to fight infantry battles, but yeah, you wouldn't generally see Marines of various navies with the kind of the full length Brown Bess musket that the British had, etc. And they'd have a whole load of rather interesting additional weapons and bits of equipment focused around short range melee and short range gunfights. And especially towards the sort of Napoleonic warfare era, you would also see a relatively high proportion of more accurate guns, sort of either the higher end muskets and in some cases rifles, because sharpshooting from the crow's nest and things like that and the fighting platforms of masts was definitely a thing. Much more common than it would be on a normal infantry battlefield. So sharpshooters very definitely more common in the Marines than in regular infantry. Dave Collier asks, can you tell us a bit about the drinking of grog in the Royal Navy, how it came to be, and what traditions were associated with it? Also, have you tried it and did you like it? So, grog is, well, it's any number of diluted alcoholic beverages served aboard a warship, but more generally in the Royal Navy, it's generally held to be rum. So, the initial outlay being half a pint of rum mixed with a quart of water, and you get that in two lots. So, it's a water to rum ratio of about 4 to 1. So, you're talking about being issued about 2.5 to 3 pints, depending on how generous dash stingy your officers are, of grog per day. So yes, there's that. That is the origin of grog. The drinking of grog, well, it's everybody. Everybody drank it. It was greeted with general enthusiasm. Grog was introduced basically because England got hold of a bunch of Caribbean colonies which could produce rum in the mid 17th century. Before that, ships had carried beer or other lower alcohol content beverages, and the general reason for this was because at the time, if you wanted fresh water, you had to take it with you. There wasn't such a thing as desalination, so you had to take barrels and barrels of fresh water with you. Putting barrels of fresh water in a cool, dark environment, especially at sea, you would very quickly end up with water going off and all sorts of wonderful things growing in it. So mixing it with alcohol was a good way of disguising the fact that some of the water might taste absolutely revolting, but it was also a very good way of killing anything that might have gotten into the water, especially when you're talking about something as high alcohol content as a rum. So yeah, that's why people drank it, and of course, well, it's alcohol. A sailor is always very enthusiastic about consuming large amounts of alcohol. I'd say that, so that's kind of the origins of it and why they would drink it. One of the common naval myths that goes around is that it was introduced to combat scurvy. It wasn't. It was introduced to make sure people didn't die horribly from contaminated water. Later on, it would include things like lemon juice and sugar, which were introduced to help combat scurvy. But that was in part because, well, trying to get a bunch of sailors to drink lemon juice daily was a bit of a hiding to nothing. So they thought, oh, we'll stick it in the diluted rum, and then they won't notice the taste, but the health effects are beneficial. So yeah, that's that's a small naval myth dispelled for you. Traditions associated with it, well, it was generally served out of barrels. The barrels fairly quickly took on, as well as being issued twice a day, that was a tradition. You got 2 rations a day. The barrels or tubs would end up very quickly having a label stuck on them in brass. So quite often you see things like what they usually say, the insert, whether it's king or queen at the time, God bless him dash her. Ironically enough, the concentration became more alcoholic over time. So it started off as 4 to 1. By the time you get into World War One, it's 3 to 1, and by the time you get to World War Two and the post-war Navy until its abolition, it's now 2 to 1. Although part of that is because other drinks become available as refrigeration, metal storage containers, and eventually desalination plants become available. Another tradition was if you were found to be neglectful of your duties, or you actually managed to get yourself drunk, you could be given extra diluted grog, so you get more liquid but less alcohol, which is absolutely terrible punishment for most sailors. Other traditions that grew up around it include on celebratory days for the Royal Navy, such as, well, after 1805, the Battle of Trafalgar, or the reigning monarch's birthday, you might get an extra ration. You might also be issued with an extra ration if your ship showed significant performance, sort of best gunnery in the fleet. Although the idea of giving your best gunners in the fleet even more alcohol, possibly slightly counterintuitive, but there you go. Then you would also it will also have if there was some kind of notable thing like the coronation of a monarch, or news of a major battle victory coming through, people might get extra rations at that point. But there's lots of excuses why you could give people extra rations, and even after the discontinuation of the rum ration, there are still occasions, regular occasions, where Royal Navy ships may choose to issue such rations to their sailors. Also, if you were an officer, you had a choice, or relatively high rank, you had a choice to take your rum undiluted without any water in it. So yeah, if you really wanted to knock yourself off balance, you could try and down half a pint of rum, and before the next person in the queue wanted his ration. That'd be amusing to watch. In terms of have I tried it, yes, I have. I have a recipe, the normal Royal Navy recipe. Of course, being me, I've decided to go with the late World War II Royal Navy recipe. So that is 2-to-1 dilution ratio, with the dilution liquid being a mixture of water, lemon juice, and cinnamon. I occasionally like to put a bit of sugar in as well, but to be honest, the quality depends entirely on the rum that you used. To be perfectly honest, to get a good rum, I particularly like Kraken. Then it's really nice. Some of the more regular store-bought stuff becomes a bit vile and revolting, but there you go. Who knows? Maybe I'll bring some to Tankfest if anybody shows up to say hi. So Long John asks, can you expand further on how a High Seas Fleet versus US Navy situation will play out specifically in 1918? Does it still have a German advantage? Okay, so if we're going to go via 1918, I'm going to arbitrarily choose the end of the war. And of course, one of the first things to point out is the High Seas Fleet in 1918 has morale that has reached rock bottom and started to dig. So we are going to tentatively assume that this is not the case, and the High Seas Fleet is basically at normal morale levels. Otherwise, it's just a case of, oh, look, an American, oh, can't be bothered, I'm going home. End of story. So yeah, assuming normal morale purposes, it is a much, much closer fight than in 1914. But at the same time, there are advantages and disadvantages on both sides. So at the end of 1918, the US Navy has 16 dreadnought battleships, if you include the South Carolinas, in service. The USS Idaho, Tennessee, and California are still under construction, as obviously are the Colorados. The Colorados are miles away from completion, but the Tennessee class and the New Mexico class Idaho are still in the process of being built and won't be commissioned until the following year at least. I would tentatively suggest that taking the South Carolinas is probably a bad idea, considering that without them your battle line speed is about 21 knots. With them your battle line speed is 18 knots. The US Navy seemed to agree at the time, so if we discount the South Carolinas from the battle line, that means you've got 14 dreadnoughts going from the Delawares all the way up to the first two New Mexicos. There's still basically no cruiser screen. But there's an awful lot more destroyers. Plenty of destroyers to go around, and some of them quite capable as well. So that's the US Navy. Let's look at the Germans. So the Germans have 19 dreadnought battleships, so they have a slight advantage over the Americans there in terms of numbers, albeit that the 4 Nassau class, again, are limited in speed, albeit, okay, they're 20 knots instead of 21 knots, but it is still a limitation. Also, obviously, in terms of broadside, both the 4 Nassaus and then also the 4 Helgolands have the hexagonal gun layout, which means their broadside is limited to 8 guns, whereas the US Navy, all of their ships, starting with the Delawares, are able to fire more than that. Obviously, Delaware with 10 guns, Florida class with 10 guns. Then you're up to 12 guns for the Wyomings, and then it's 10 for the New York, 10 for the Nevada, and then 12 for the Pennsylvania and New Mexico classes. Conversely, if you look at the German ships, once you've discounted, well, not discounted, but once you've gone past the Helgolands and the Nassaus with their 8-gun broadsides, you have 10-gun broadsides on the Kaiser class and the Koenig class, and then you're down to 8 gun broadsides, albeit of 15-inch caliber, on Bayern and Baden. So if I have my math right with the battleship engagement, the Germans have 164 gun barrels on their ultimate broadside, and the Americans have 152. So it's relatively close, especially when you consider that quite a number of those gun barrels on the American warships, obviously the New Mexicos, Pennsylvanias, Nevadas, and New Yorks are all 14-inch guns, albeit with accuracy issues, whereas a lot of all the German guns, bar Bayern and Baden, are 11 and 12-inch guns, with Bayern and Baden with 15-inch weapons. Now, the elephant in the room is the battle cruisers. Germany still has 5 of them. It's lost Lutzow at Jutland, and obviously Goeben has become Yavuk Sultan Selim, but it still has von der Tann, Moltke, Seydlitz, Derflinger, and Hindenburg, and those bring in obviously a whole new bunch of guns. The US Navy, on the other hand, in terms of its cruisers, is not so well endowed. So it's going to have to make up for that deficiency by just having massive numbers of destroyers. Whether or not that'll actually give it a victory, I don't know. So yeah, basically battle line, in terms of the absolute battleship battle line, apart from the fact the US fleet is slightly outnumbered, they've got a reasonable chance if they can position themselves in such a way as they can bring about an engagement where they're initially shooting at part of the German fleet and not the whole thing. Their overall slightly greater broadside weight should make up for the slightly lesser number of ships and gun barrels. Now, with that said, as and when the battle cruisers get involved, it's going to be a completely different issue, and of course the fact that the battle cruisers exist means the US fleet screen is going to be very hard pressed. So it could go either way. In a conventional setup, I would probably still give the advantage to the high seas fleet at that point, assuming, as I said before, that morale was not an issue, which obviously in 1918 it was. However, unlike 1914, there are ways for the US fleet to get around this. I say, if they make a fleet screen up of hundreds upon hundreds of destroyers, that may well be enough to swarm the German battle cruisers and cruisers, and the German destroyer designs are significantly less capable than things like the Wicks and Clemson classes that the US Navy is able to churn out in mass numbers. It's basically going to come down to whether or not mass destroyer attacks can drive off or significantly damage large portions of the otherwise heavier cruiser and battle cruiser fleet screen that the high seas fleet has. If they can, then in a straight up gunfight, the US Navy has a decent chance. If they can't, then obviously those heavier forces are going to blow through and give the high seas fleet a decisive advantage. Mackinson asks, what was the significance of Britain capturing the Danish Navy in 1807? In terms of the actual capture of ships, the occurrence was not that significant, because although the Royal Navy took quite a number of Danish warships, only a few of them saw active service with the Royal Navy, and at this point in 1807 the Royal Navy already had a numerical ascendancy over the French. The larger significance of the taking of the Danish Navy in 1807 was twofold. One, it denied those ships to the French, which was perhaps far more important, because there were serious concerns that the French would either form an alliance with Denmark or would just come in and take over the fleet anyway. But secondly, it was a very decisive response to Napoleon's implementation of the continental system. Obviously, the continental system, after Trafalgar, when Napoleon realised he couldn't beat the British at sea, he decided to try and kill the British economy by forbidding all of Europe, but either via direct control or by treaty, from trading with Britain, which obviously relied on its merchant marine to bring in the large amounts of money it needed to fight the whole of Europe at once. Denmark at this point was still officially neutral, but under a lot of pressure to join the system from the French, who obviously had armies on their borders, and so they did so. The Danish fleet, Denmark as a trading partner would have been useful to the British, but one of the larger issues was that as with the attack that Nelson had done 6 years earlier, the Danish fleet was in the perfect position to block British merchant ships from being able to access the Baltic, and that's where a lot of supplies, sort of masts, spars, and rigging could be found. So it was more of a strategic threat to the Royal Navy as well as a general threat, because obviously there was trading opportunities to be done with Russia and Sweden and such like. And the British knew that there were a lot of, even if nations might join the continental system, they knew there were an awful lot of ports and merchants in the Baltic who would quite happily look the other way in order to receive British goods. But if the British merchant ships couldn't get there because of the Danish fleet, they weren't going to make any money or acquire any naval supplies. So by capturing the Danish fleet, and although it did bring Denmark into the war on France's side, it meant that militarily Denmark didn't have that much to offer it. It meant that British merchant trade in the Baltic and also trade in strategic materials could continue, and that was the important part of it, because that was the significance of it. It basically meant that Britain could have continued merchant access to the Baltic, and it also demonstrated to a lot of Europe that Britain was still capable of just standing up to Napoleon and rejecting anything that he tried to impose on them. Lewis Maskell asks, how effective were the Flower class corvettes in the Battle for the Atlantic? So the Flower class, well, they ended up making up about half of all escort vessels in the Atlantic, so that gives you some idea about their effectiveness. They were obviously originally designed as quick and easy way of boosting escort numbers without impinging on the fleet destroyer numbers and drawing those off for escort. Now, obviously, they did have some defects, which was most especially their slow speed, which resulted in their eventual superseding in construction by the River class and the Castle class. However, that isn't to diminish what they were capable of. Given their initial design parameters and their relatively limited armament, they were still very effective at keeping U-boats away from convoys. Their slow speed meant they weren't quite as adept at chasing down and sinking them, but if you compare the early losses suffered by convoys and small groups of merchant ships in World War One against much less capable submarines, versus the losses of convoys that were protected by Flower class corvettes in the early part of the Second World War, the Flower class were remarkably effective at what they did, because basically they didn't have to kill a sub. All they had to do was force it under and hold it under for long enough that the convoy could pass by, and then the submarine would have a major issue catching up, if it could at all. Wolfpack tactics did tend to diminish their effectiveness, because obviously while it was chasing down one sub, another sub could show up and attack. But then again, the fact that you could build them in mass numbers meant that there could be more than one Flower class, quite a few obviously, in a convoy. So yeah, in terms of their effectiveness, given the circumstances that they were built in, they were pretty much. I mean, you could always make some improvements on something that's built as an emergency, but they were definitely highly effective, and there are probably thousands of sailors still alive who owe their lives to the fact that the Flower class were able to broadly protect their convoys from the worst intentions of the Kriegsmarine's U-boat arm. Tuning 3434 asks, what was the influence of the Dutch Regiment de Marine of 1665 on the development of the British Royal Marines and or vice versa, and all other marine corps, such as what kind of sea soldiers did the French Navy develop? The origins of the Dutch and British Marines actually go back to pretty much almost exactly the same period, with the Royal Marines first officially recognised ancestor being found in 1664, then the Dutch in 1665. So their influence on each other, especially since both of them were fresh forces in the Second Anglo-Dutch War, was pretty much of a mutual thing. Both sides learned from each other and went through, in some ways, similar periods of history, with their force sizes expanding and contracting as they went. There were earlier Marine Corps. The Spanish had a Marine Corps, the Portuguese, and the French all had Marine Corps before the British and the Dutch formed their Marine Corps. Now, in terms of the French ones, the French Marines were somewhat different from the Dutch and British forces because the French Marine soldiers were supposed to be colonial defence troops on land, plus also the gunners of the ships, plus also the sort of security and defence and boarding parties for the ships as well. Obviously, some of those roles did eventually get dropped, but with sailors taking over gunnery positions. But the idea in France of the Marines having their own artillery units, plus being colonial defence and garrison troops, plus still being naval infantry, did persist. So the French Marines had a much wider remit for most of their history. Obviously, both Dutch and British Royal Marines would have their own artillery later on, and to a certain degree would man some of the turrets in ships, but they wouldn't have that kind of same either long-term garrison duty generally imposed upon them, nor would they have the idea that they would be the sole gunnery men on a warship at all. So both the Dutch and Royal Marines would evolve into effectively highly elite naval infantry forces, obviously with a focus initially on boarding and ship security at sea, but also with a landing element, and also then coming through in today, they would have they've become a lot. They've had a lot more of sort of amphibious roles. Although amphibious assaults are still by and large done by the army, there are obviously notable actions where Royal Marines and Dutch Marines in their various respective nations' campaigns have taken part in amphibious landings, assaults, etc., and not a few special forces operations either. Bryce McDonald asks, can you talk about the American and Royal Navies experimenting with rubber decks on aircraft carriers after World War II? And no, that's not a joke. The British started it, and the Americans continued experimenting with it. It was actually a genuine idea at the time. Basically, it came down to the fact that with carrier aircraft getting heavier and heavier, there was a need to save weight, or a perceived need to save weight, and especially with some of the acceleration and performance issues of early jet engines and the fact they were incredibly fuel hungry. So one of the ideas that was come up with was, well, landing gear is incredibly heavy, complicated, and dead weight when you're in the air, so what if we get rid of it? This had been popular for quite a while, but with propeller-driven aircraft, obviously lowering the overall position of the aircraft to flush with the flight deck was a very bad idea because the propeller would just chew its way through the flight deck. However, with these wonderful new jet engine thingies, they realised that this no longer applied, and an aircraft could be made such that its underside could just scrape quite happily along a deck, assuming the deck was soft enough. And so the idea of these rubberized flight decks was generated. And the idea was basically to say, with this weight saved from having to use landing gear, you could then devote that to more weapons or more fuel or just lighter weight for higher performance, etc. As you can see in the background, it kind of worked. And Supermarine, makers of the Spitfire, actually went so far as to design an aircraft specifically to use this. Unfortunately, the flight regimen necessary to correctly align your aircraft to land on a rubberized flight deck was quite demanding, and that's even while in relatively calm conditions. One of the wonderful advantages of landing gear is it does give you a little bit of forgiveness when it comes to dropping in onto an aircraft carrier's flight deck, whereas if you're trying to just land belly first, you have to be absolutely sure you're perfectly straight and level. Otherwise, your wing's going to dig in, and then you're going to go cartwheeling off the ship, or worse, into the ship's island. And of course, there are relative issues with pitch, because again, with landing gear, you can come in flared up with your nose slightly up in the air, whereas with a rubberized flight deck, you would have to come in pretty much dead level and falling out the air relatively rapidly. So it was very demanding on pilots, and it was eventually found that actually probably too much of a demand on regular pilots, especially in rough sea conditions. Plus the fact that, as you can probably guess, the whole thing relied on pure friction to slow the aircraft down, with a little bit of a rest of wires considered, which meant that as aircraft got heavier and more powerful, it was never going to be quite viable. So it was a good idea for maybe 3 or 4 years immediately after the Second World War, when jet aircraft had a number of performance issues and were relatively small and lightweight compared to what they would become. But once those issues were resolved and you started to get more and more powerful jet aircraft in the 50s and 60s, it wasn't really viable anymore and too many problems to overcome compared to the few advantages it offered. Matt Blom asks, how effective was the Royal Canadian Navy in their convoy escort duties during World War II? Well, as mentioned in the answers to some of the earlier questions, the Royal Canadian Navy started off very small. It went through a crash expansion because the Canadians were very determined to do their part, not in the least because there were a lot of Canadian sailors out there on the merchant ships. And in the initial part of the war, they did suffer from the fact that, being a relatively small navy forced to expand massively, the available talent pool of trained officers was diluted very widely, which meant that in the early part of the war, some Canadian warships were known to make some pretty basic mistakes because of the inexperience of their crews. However, they did get with the program pretty quickly, and by the middle of the war, the numbers of ships that they had obviously grown quite large, but their crews now had experience in what they were doing, which then meant as more and more ships started to come online, the relative dilution of talent was much less, and obviously with veterans as opposed to merely peacetime trained crews, they were able to impart a lot more useful lessons to the newer crews as well. So by, say, 41-ish, the Royal Canadian Navy was a pretty effective convoy escorting force, and that was its primary role during most of World War II, to the point that it actually, by numerically, became the third largest navy in the world, albeit almost entirely confined to the North Atlantic and mostly made up of small ships. It held that title whilst only having 2 light cruisers to its name and a couple of escort carriers. So, yeah, again, this is the thing. It's very easy to look at anti-submarine warfare efforts in terms of U-boats sunk, but that isn't really the point. The point of convoy escort duty is to make sure your convoy gets to the destination safely. If you don't sink a single enemy U-boat during a voyage, but you don't lose any of your ships, then your voyage has been 100% successful. If you sink 10 U-boats but you arrive with a single merchant ship, you've actually failed. And in those terms, the Royal Canadian Navy proved itself, once it had got its act together a little bit from its crash expansion, to be a very effective anti-submarine convoy escort force. I mean, the fact, as I said, as kind of intimated in some of the earlier answers, is the fact that although Germany didn't possess the number of U-boats it desired, merchant shipping broadly hadn't improved that much since World War One. Submarine technology definitely had. If the German Kriegsmarine U-boats had been presented with the same kind of merchant shipping situation that the High Seas Fleet U-boats had had in the first couple of years of the First World War, the result would have been complete and utter carnage and decimation. And you get a small hint of what some of that might have been like when you see what happened to some shipping off of the US coast immediately after the US declared war and periods such as that. But with the Royal Canadian Navy effectively to a certain extent, by not quite taking over, but almost by the end of the Second World War, the operations in the North Atlantic, the fact that the vast majority of convoyed ships managed to get through safely and with their cargoes and crews intact is as much a testament to the skill, courage, and determination of the Royal Canadian Navy as it is to the similar skills of the Royal Navy's escorts, because usually it was almost 50-50 split or thereabouts. So, yeah, very, very effective once they'd got themselves working properly. And of course, the number of sort of tribal class destroyers they had also very useful off of the European coast, like such as HMS Hyder. So don't forget that, even though it was a smaller part of the Royal Canadian Navy's overall war effort. Julian Arnott asks, what was the biggest mistake in World War II in terms of Navy strategy for each Navy? Well, it's very easy to be very glib and say that the main mistake of the Kriegsmarine and the Imperial Japanese Navy was to go to war at all in the first place, but that's kind of a bit of a low-hanging fruit. So let's look at things in more sort of granular terms. I think the single biggest mistake in World War II that the Royal Navy made was probably their idea of submarine hunting and near unsupported carrier operations in the first part of the Second World War. It cost them courageous and glorious very, very early in the war, which was a big setback. I mean, yes, Courageous, Glorious, and Furious were never going to be quite as useful as Lexington and Saratoga, but when you look at how how useful HMS Furious was during the Second World War, if you then factor in that you might have got similar levels of use out of Courageous and Glorious, that is quite a significant bit of combat capability that's been lost by poor decision making on the Royal Navy's part. And that can have butterflies all over the place. I mean, obviously, we can never tell because obviously ships were sunk, etc. And so this didn't happen. But you could even make a plausible argument that had Courageous and Glorious not been effectively wasted so early in the war, there's a strong chance that one or the other of them might have been available, probably Courageous to be honest, for the home fleet during the time of the Bismarck breaking out. And so instead of the relatively untested and still working up HMS Victorious, which then sailed late with King George V, you might have seen one or the other being sent out with Prince of Wales and Hood. So that might have affected the Battle of the Denmark Strait, which then in turn might have resulted in the Hood not being blown to pieces. So yeah, that would be the biggest mistake in World War II for Navy strategy for the British, I think. The biggest strategic mistake for the US Navy probably almost entirely centers around torpedoes, both enemy and their own. I mean, obviously, we've gone over the issues with the Mark 14 at length quite a number of times, but the lack of willingness of the more senior US Navy officers to back up the captains and crews of the ships that were reporting problems with the Mark 14 was probably a massive strategic mistake. Buord really needed to get their act together, and if a number of higher ranking US admirals had gotten in on the act of pressuring them sooner, that might then have resulted in the Mark 14 being fixed earlier. But sort of similarly, not exactly related, but similarly, is the fact that they severely underestimated the Long Lance and some of the Long Lance's reputation. Although it obviously is a very good weapon, it can't be just discounted offhand. But part of its effectiveness against US Navy warships in the early part of the Pacific campaign was down to the fact the US Navy badly underestimated just how long range and how powerful this thing could be. They spent a good amount of time searching for other explanations as to why ships had randomly blown up and either been sunk or badly damaged, because they just wouldn't accept that. I mean, fair enough, with the Mark 14 floating around, you can possibly understand why, but they couldn't accept that the Japanese torpedoes might be able to reach out that far for a while. So yeah, underestimation of how good dash how bad torpedoes could be would probably be the US Navy's greatest strategic mistake. Let's go on to, let's see, Italy. I mean, France, their greatest strategic mistake was probably to have people like Admiral Jean Soule in charge, but I think we'll just leave the French for the minute. The Italians, they're well, yeah. The Italians were designed to fight. They designed their navy to fight the French and ended up fighting the British. So that's probably strategic mistake number one, but that veers a bit too close to they got involved in the war at all territory. In other terms, probably being a bit too lax on the quality control acceptance, which badly hampered their effectiveness, especially battleships, in compared to how they should have performed. I'd say it's probably a toss up between that or the broader strategic mistake of going for exceptionally high speed, relatively unarmored almost ships when it came to their cruiser forces and such, because they ended up with light cruisers that could lose to like a tribal class destroyer in a decent gunfight. And again, not to discount the achievements of HMAS Sydney, but if HMAS Sydney had taken on a couple of Tenryus or a couple of Königsbergs or a couple of Omahas, I'm not necessarily sure I'd rate their chances in a 2-on-1 fight in that manner. Whereas when Sydney came across two Italian light cruisers, it was even though it was a Leander class light cruiser itself, and therefore not even on the level like a Town or a Cleveland, it quite comfortably ran both of them off and sank one of them. So yeah, that would probably be the broader strategic mistake by the Italian fleet. Single biggest German strategic mistake would be trying to do everything at once with a small navy. I think that they tried to build a battleship force and a heavy cruiser force and a light cruiser force and a destroyer force and a submarine force and an aircraft carrier force, and they had neither the economy nor the funding to actually do so. And as a result, they ended up having something for each of those roles, albeit the Graf Zeppelin never got quite finished, and no significant force at the start of the war for any single one of them. So if, say, if they'd not gone for aircraft carriers and put those resources into building U-boats, or they'd decided that after the Königsbergs that maybe light cruisers weren't such a good idea and to throw the money into building Hipper class or so on and so on and so on. They just needed to concentrate more on a few things as a small navy rather than go for anything and everything all over the place. They didn't have a colonial empire to defend, and given what they knew they were going to be fighting, I think that they would have been better off concentrating on medium to large destroyers, larger cruisers, and small to medium capital ships. I think they did need to build the Bismarck class to take on things like Richelieu, but again, slightly overdid it, I think. And in terms of the Japanese, ironically enough, having talked about the Americans, the Japanese suffered from putting a bit too much emphasis strategically on fleet battles, and as a result, they ended up with very little capability to take on anti-submarine warfare, and they kind of, because they relied on these big decisive fleet engagements under the assumption that they would win when slightly smaller scale but still fairly decisive fleet engagements like Midway happened and such. When they lost, it was kind of, well, what do we do now? We didn't foresee this possibility. Meanwhile, in the background, American submarines are quite happily poking holes in the Japanese merchant marine. So, yeah, the Japanese strategic mistake, I think, would be far too much focus on a Mahanian style fleet battle to the exclusion of almost anything else, not realizing that the other side might not want to play that game. Terminus Est asks, why did Russia not focus on capital ship construction during the interwar period? In large part because they couldn't. They did not possess the industry to make armour plate of sufficient thickness. Their gun industry was iffy, and the last capital ships that had been designed in Russia had been designed at the beginning of World War I. And with the Communist Revolution declaring that if you'd had anything to do with the royals and or you had any kind of education to a point that you were smart enough to perhaps point out any issues at all with the glorious Bolshevik Revolution, then you would be shot or sent to Gulag, or sent to Gulag and then shot, or possibly shot and then your body would be sent to Gulag. But there you go. There's Russia for you. And between that and the fact that Stalin was somewhat unstable and randomly purging anybody who had any kind of qualification, the ability of Russian naval design to maintain its cadre of experts was, shall we say, somewhat reduced. So yeah, between not being able to actually maintain much of a design cadre to make the drawings of the ships in the first place, and then also not having the industry to actually produce the necessary armor plate, weapons, engines, etc., to build the ships. And the fact that they were going through the after effects of the revolution of 1917 onwards. That's basically why Russia didn't focus on capital ship construction in the interwar period, and also had Russia's a massive land power. Of all the various powers involved in World War II, they had the least need for a fleet. And so when they eventually did decide that they wanted to build ships, they had to effectively rebuild their shipbuilding industry from scratch, including the design aspects, by dragging in mostly Italian design expertise and some manufacturing expertise, as well as some stuff from Germany. Then obviously they would leverage that through World War II, to the point that after World War II they were actually capable of churning out a fair number of pretty capable designs. But in the interwar period, Russia was not a place you wanted to go to find competent or rapid ship design. I mean, if you even look at the stuff they did manage to churn out during that period, stuff like the Kirov class cruisers, yeah, slightly heavier than average cruisers. In theory, everything looks fine, fantastic. In practice, you end up with heavy cruiser grade firepower with the fire rate of a battleship. So yeah, not particularly Russia's finest hour. And finally, Gabriel A. Hawkins asks, what do you think the 5 most significant naval battles were? So there are so many large naval battles that potentially turn the course of history one way or the other. It's very difficult to pick 5. So I'm gonna try and divide it up by era rather than top 5, because otherwise, if I start in any particular era, I'll probably pick 5 very important historical battles just from that era and leave nothing else out. So, if we look at what we know of ancient naval warfare, my pick for the ancient sort of Roman period and earlier would tie. There'd be almost a 4-way tie between the Battle of Actium, which between Mark Antony and Cleopatra versus Octavian, which determined who would be in charge of the Roman Empire for its very formative early imperial period. So that's definitely on the list. The Battle of Salamis, obviously between the combined Greek city-states and the Persians, although mostly the Athenian fleet, that stopped the Persian sea advance and hampered their strategic mobility, which would then later allow for battles like Plataea and such to prevent the Persian invasion of Greece. And of course, if the Persians had successfully invaded Greece, there's no guarantee we would have gotten Alexander the Great and that whole period of history. So again, very significant. At the same time, there were a couple of major battles in the Punic Wars between Carthage and Rome. Initially, Carthage ran rampant over what the Romans had in terms of navy, and it looked for a while like Carthage might supplant Rome as the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. But a couple of major battles between a built in the first place, should we say, Roman fleet and the Carthaginians, despite the fact the Romans had a lot less experience at sea, they managed to win those battles, took a lot of the Carthaginian fleet to the bottom or captured, and yeah, that was a major turning point in the Punic Wars. It forced the campaign basically to be on land, so you got the exploits of Hannibal and such, but the Romans were much more comfortable with dealing with land campaigns than sea ones. So there's that. And if you want to reach right back into history, you've also got what was technically half land, half sea battle, but not officially named, but the defeat of the Sea Peoples by Ramesses III, which, as far as we can tell, at the sort of end of the Bronze Age, with the Bronze Age collapse, that may likely have prevented the Sea Peoples from completing the bingo card of wiping out almost every major Bronze Age civilization. So yeah, thanks for that, Ramses III. Third time lucky, I guess, with that name. So yeah, you can pick any one from that era, I think. If you then want to look at the sort of post-Roman era up to around about the start of the classic Age of Sail, then my top three picks for that would be the Battle of Lepanto. Although they failed to exploit that victory, the victory over the Ottoman forces did check Ottoman naval expansion in the Mediterranean and would then force the confrontations between the Western and Ottoman powers kind of to take place along the lines of European mostly having control of the Western Mediterranean and the Ottomans having control of the Eastern Mediterranean, rather than steady Ottoman expansion crushing everything in sight across the Mediterranean. So fairly important turning point there. Obviously the Spanish Armada. If the Spanish had managed to land in England, if the Spanish had managed to pick up the Duke of Parma's army and then land in England, that would have been a massive change in history if England had just become a Spanish vassal state for who knows how long. Then again, my Spanish might have improved. So that's definitely up there. And single battle-wise, probably the Battle of Chesapeake Bay, although that is getting into the Age of Sail era. But obviously with supplies cut off, that forced the British surrender at Yorktown and therefore sort of cemented in the independence of the United States. If the British had managed to win that against the French and keep the supply lines open to Yorktown, then along with naval support, then the American War of Independence may have taken a very different turn. So yeah, pick any one of those three. In terms of slot number 3 for the Age of Sail, although there are a number of decisive battles in terms of deciding a war, the single most decisive engagement of the classic Age of Sail, I think, pretty much has to be agreed to be Trafalgar. Although the French Navy takes a lot longer to finally put down, it finally put a stamp on the Royal Navy's ascendancy over the Franco-Spanish alliance, and it puts paid to Napoleon's ideas of conquering Britain, and it basically becomes the start of about 100 years where the Royal Navy is the unchallenged master of the seven seas, which leads to the Victorian era, helps the Industrial Revolution, and to a certain degree creates the world we know of today. Then getting into the modern era, the Battle of Tsushima almost makes the rating, but it's part of a series of naval battles, and it was fairly clear from things like the Battle of the Yellow Sea and the grinding campaign of attrition, etc., that Russia was never going to win that war. So, although Tsushima is a very nice, pretty centerpiece to it, the fact that it occurred at all is more because of Russia just not reading the writing on the wall than anything else. So I don't think Tsushima merits a spot on the top 5 most significant naval battles. So we're looking at the age of sort of steam and steel at this point. So my two picks for slot 4 and 5 in this point, I'm going to go with Jutland, because the phrase Jellicoe was the only man who could lose the war in an afternoon is very much correct. And he didn't, and so the war wasn't lost, and you can extrapolate out from that with a continued blockade of Germany that in many ways not so much any victory, but the British failure to lose at Jutland is what is effectively this slow stranglehold on the German economy and people that eventually results in the social unrest that eventually sees Germany pull out of the war in 1918 with the Treaty of Versailles. So Jutland's definitely up there. And then if you get into World War II, I would say you probably, of all the naval engagements in World War II, you'd probably have to go for Midway as something of a turning point, because up until then, the Japanese have either won naval battles, or when you look at something like Coral Sea, it's a 50-50, whereas the strategic victory goes to the Americans, but a tactical victory in terms of actual numbers of ships lost goes to the Japanese. Midway is, although the Americans do obviously lose ships at Midway, Midway is fairly decisive in breaking the Japanese Navy's strike power in terms of numbers of ships sunk, especially carriers, as well as proving to the Americans that they can actually take the Japanese on in a straight fight and come up with a decisive tactical victory in a large-scale engagement, as opposed to blocking the Japanese objectives, but at a greater cost to American ships and men than the Japanese. And that, I think, is probably the turning point for the Pacific in terms of, after that, the balance of victories, both in strategic and tactical objective terms, very much start shifting towards the US Navy side of things. And with that, we draw this episode of the Drydock, the longest official single episode of the Drydock in history, not taking into account the Part A and Part B one earlier, a few this year. Yes, it brings it to a close. Thank goodness for that. And I'm now going to go and get myself a drink, probably grog.